Through the Gates of Death, Dion Fortune. Chapter 3. Helping or Hindering the Dead. The question of communication with the departed has always been a vexed one. On the one hand, we have those who deny its possibility and say that all so-called communications are either fraud, delusion, or credulity. On the other are those who admit the possibility of traffic with the dead, but call it necromancy and condemn it unsparingly. Meanwhile, those who have lost the dear ones have recourse in rapidly increasing numbers to mediums who act, or claim to act, as psychic telephones between this world and the next. It is agreed by those who have extended experience in the matter that although communication with the departed is by no means universally to be condemned, it needs to be approached with caution, under carefully chosen conditions, and a state of extreme grief and desperate emotional upheaval is certainly not the ideal condition under which an approach should be made. Sometimes the state of mind of the bereaved is such that it is advisable for the dead to return to give the desired assurance, but to do so is an act of self-sacrifice on their part, and nothing can possibly be worse for the departing soul than to be called back repeatedly to communicate with those left behind. To hold the soul to physical life in this way is an act of great, though no doubt unintentional, selfishness. It disturbs the one who has entered into the light, and prevents him from settling down in his new conditions. It is just as a fond mother placed her child at a boarding school, and then kept on sending him and weeping over her loneliness and lamenting the parting. What would be the state of mind of a child who was treated like that? He would get no pleasure from his new companions and his sports, nor profit from his lessons. If we keep on calling the departed back to us through the instrumentality of a medium, are acting just as unwisely and selfishly as the foolish mother. As soon as this life ends, the next life begins, and the dead have their own work to do. We must be content to let them do it freely and in their own way, just as a woman, however loving and beloved, must be content to let her husband or son go forth to do their work in the world. It is noticeable in the communications received from the departed that the newly dead are fairly accessible to communication, and then, after a while, they seem to go on to a further plane, where communication ceases to be possible. If we keep on calling them back, they cannot make this transition and become earthbound. The process of death is incomplete, and they cannot enter into their rest, while therefore it may be justifiable or even advisable to re-establish communication with those who have just passed over. It is in every way undesirable to keep up this communication unduly. It should be enough for us that those who have passed out sent us word of their safe arrival upon the other shore. Having received that, we ought to rest content. The state into which the dead enter immediately after departure is an intermediate and transitional state, and it is one in which certain definite post-mortem pathologies can occur. Cases in which all has not gone well are delayed there, awaiting the working out of their problems. Normally the soul passes swiftly through this phase and leaves it behind. Delay at this stage is very undesirable. The soul should be speeded on its journey, and it is for this purpose that the Catholic Church says Masses for the dead. These Masses are of great value, and the principle should be reintroduced into the liturgies of all faiths. We should not think that we have rendered the last office to the dead, when the funeral service has been said over them, but the consolidations of religion should follow them right through the transition stage until they are well established in their new life. As long as any sheds of earth ties linger, the protection and guidance of organized religion should be available to the soul. This intermediate stage between life and death is not the same thing as purgatory. It is rather a landing stage whereon the soul steps ashore and gathers together its baggage and greets its friends. Purgatory might be defined as a psychic quarantine. It is only after consciousness has accustomed itself to the disembodied life that the soul goes on to face purification of purgatory. Let it be clearly realized that purgatory is not punitive, nor is it eternal, but consists in forcing the soul to face its own record. It is the reactions to the soul to that record which are the cleansing fires. Purgatory is not a place, but a state of consciousness. But because, on the inner planes, all those with the same outlook draw together, purgatory, for all practical psychic purposes, has a definite astral location. It is while souls are going through their purgatory that the threads of communication with this world are severed. Each soul must enter into the silence in order to pass through the cleansing fires. No one can help them there. They must stand upon their own feet and walk by such light as they have. Not otherwise can they learn their lessons. We can no more learn for another than we can eat for another. We must surrender our loved ones into the hands of the lords of karma when this point is reached. We have this comfort, however, that it is their aim to make, not to break the soul, and no one is given more than they can bear, nor even more than they can assimilate and turn to good use. The esotericist would not agree with the Catholic teaching that masses for the dead can help a soul in purgatory. He holds that the value of the prayers of the priest and friends is in the influence they have upon the soul during the immediatory period. Once the soul has passed through this phase and finds its place in the great cycle of life on the inner planes and will be cared for. After the soul has drawn clear of purgatory, it is not only possible but legitimate to re-establish communication with it, provided the right methods are used. If we are able to raise consciousness to the higher psychic planes, we can of our own volition come to telepathic touch with the departed and hear their voice within our inner ear. It is not advisable to try and see them with psychic vision, because this belongs to a lower subplane of astral, to that upon which the blessed departed, cleansed from their sins, are privileged to abide. Clairaudience is the right method to use in the communication with those who have passed up to the heaven world. It will be noticeable that descriptions of the heaven world are nearly always second-hand. The psychic is told what that world is like, but does not actually see it. There are, of course, exceptions to this general rule, and in the case of exceptionally gifted psychics or exceptional circumstances, but generally speaking, it would be found to hold good, and we may know if we see the departed with psychic vision, they are still in the intermediate world, and that when they have arrived safely in the heaven world, we shall hear but not see them when they attempt direct communication. When we are trying to get in touch with them, therefore, we should listen but not look, and in the still small voice of the inner consciousness we may not unreasonably expect to hear at least a word of greeting. Once contact is established, there will be times when we shall get a distinct impression of a presence so tangible that we feel we only to stretch out the hand to touch it. But if we open our eyes, we shall find nothing there. The dead upon their plane are minds without bodies, and when they speak to our mental and not to our bodily senses. That is to say, it is the intuition that perceives them, and not the sight. It is good that normal, intuitional communication should be established between the dead and the living, for it robs death of its terrors. We ought to look upon the dead as living in another state of consciousness, not another place. If we can tune in to their vibrations, we can hear them and speak to them. In fact, we can speak to them much more readily than we can hear them, for the dead, being bodiless, are normally psychic. It is for this reason that we should guard our thoughts carefully in relation to the dead, and especially strive to overcome our grief and learn to acquiescence in their departure. Our attitude towards the dead should be the same as if they had set out to seek their fortunes overseas. We would send to an emigrating son or lover a word of good cheer to hearten him in his distant enterprise. And if we continually sent a tale of woe, enlarging on our own sufferings in his absence, could we expect our letters to be eagerly welcomed? Would they not rather be dreaded as an ordeal? What should be our aim? To help and encourage and hearten the dead, or to indulge our own grief and relive our feelings at their expense? The parting and loneliness, the loss of the breadwinner and protector, or the lifelong companion, are indeed a grief, but a grief to be barely borne in order that our darkness may not overshadow the beloved one. We ought to accept our lot cheerfully, so that they may be free to go through the great experiences of the soul and enter into their rest with a quiet mind.